The slides you'll see today are drawn almost exclusively from our lectures of previous units, and they are going to play on a loop. So there won't be any kind of intentional control over what's when. We're just running through time, sort of. And what we're going to do today is look back, and this seemed to me the sort of try not to get too distracted by the images, enjoy them. We've just finished a religious studies class following American history organized by war eras. And so, we just I want to reflect and ask, what does American history or the history of war have to do with religion? Why are we studying that here? Why should a religious studies class spend its time on the history of a nation, any nation, really, but maybe especially this nation, the United States, which prides itself on a real intentional separation of church from state? With the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, it was decided that the government would not establish a religion, by financially supporting one or another church, by giving preferential treatment to one or another church, under the law especially, and it was decided that the government would not prohibit the free exercise of religion. So the state would neither compel citizens to practice nor prohibit them from doing so, right? The United States is, by law, if not in practice, a secular nation. Of course, it's never been that simple since, as religious studies scholar Steve Prothero puts it, since that time that George Washington placed his hand upon the Bible and swore allegiance to a godless constitution, things have been messy. It's been complicated. American religious adherence has ebbed and flowed throughout its history. During the colonial era, only 17% of the citizenry had church membership. In 1956, on the other hand, only 1% didn't claim adherence to one or another faith tradition. Now, by 2019, that number, what scholars, now call the nones, because when asked their religion, they say none, as in none of the above, right? Which was 1% in 1956. Those nones now are just over 23% of the population. There are now roughly the same number of nuns in America as there are Catholics or evangelicals. So institutional religions are losing their market share. That's what's happening, losing influence over the governing worldviews of a large swath of the population. Another polling model, kind of a similar poll but with another model, offers the spiritual but not religious option, SBNR. And on that model, as of 2017, 27% of Americans see themselves as SBNR, spiritual but not religious. Now, polls that ask follow-up questions find that significant numbers of both these groups, the nuns and the SBNRs, attend one or another church, temple, mosque, or center. Significant numbers of both groups pray regularly, believe in a higher power, any number of things that traditionally signal religious affiliation or adherence. But we're not living through a time when traditional categories used for understanding faith and practice hold very well. Secularism, pluralism, scientism, intersectionality, all of these things, could be causes. There's any number of good explanations for why, right? Whatever the explanation, it is the case. So when we think of living myths, right, our title, traditional institutional religious experience isn't the first thing that comes to mind, right? For plenty of good reasons. The myths, the mythic corpus, the mythos of one religious community won't be living vital elements of experience for another religious community. Increasing numbers don't affiliate with any of these communities, so their mythic realities would be sidelined, at the very least, by traditional religious models. And probably most immediately, when we talk about myth, what we're talking about is somebody else's beliefs, right? Not our own. We don't like to call our own beliefs myths. That's somebody else. We believe things or know things, right? Whoever we is. I hope that our opening unit really early disabused, in a really thorough way, thoroughly disabused us of the notion that a myth is a false story or a fiction or a fanciful or, childlike tale, something that only other people have. Myths are the unprovables that govern our thoughts. They shape our perspectives, they motivate our actions, ennoble our days, grant meaning or value or purpose to the mundane or mechanical or humdrum reality of everyday life. Things like beauty and justice fall under the category of the mythic, right? Remember mythos as opposed to logos. Mythos, that mythic corpus, those self-evident truths, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves that serve as a vehicle for the promulgation of values. The living myths, the ones that are really living, vital, potent, pervasive, commanding, right? Those are the ones that come to us as history, as unthought, unquestioned, simply true, and very early. America is the land of the free and the home of the brave, one nation under God, with liberty and justice for all, and the revolutionaries shook off the heavy and unnatural mantle of colonial rule, and the pioneers followed the sun and staked out a land for independence and self-determination on the frontier. And America, finding freedom, has fought for it, to defend it all over the world ever since, right? And well before this class, most of us knew that that story was at least a little bit inflated, a little bit idealized, where it wasn't outright fabricated. Even so, most of us still associate with the ideals of freedom, liberty, justice, equality, independence, defense of the powerless, right? However skeptical we might be about the gilded history that we've received, it continues to convey a set of values, a mythos. I've talked about complacency in previous lectures, but Americans haven't in any simple or comprehensive way become complacent, any more than the nuns or the SBNRs are sort of complacent about meaning or value or purpose. We're not simply satisfied with the way things are as a citizenry. I'd wager that, every one of us has a list of things about America that we'd like to fix, and those lists themselves would vary and would be often at odds, right? As a nation, we're polarized, we're divided, and we're distracted by an overload of genuine and profound catastrophes. But we haven't just slumped into an unthinking acceptance of the pervasive injustice that's come to characterize our polity. We aren't just complacent. Neither, though, have we risen to the challenge we've been presented with, a challenge that's made up at least as much of self-inflicted causes on a national scale as it is by the vicissitudes of fortune, right? What we've done as a nation, as a culture, is to self-interestedly, self-servingly seek personal gain amidst deepening chaos. What we've done is largely to put our own interests above those of any larger, morally buoyed purpose. What we've done is to abdicate any and all civic responsibility to the story that guides us, any responsibility to shaping that story in the context of history and of futurity, with the practice of both self-reflection and situational awareness. As a citizenry, we've abdicated that duty. And it's easy to see this in our cultural consumerism, right? With all its identifiable myths, that what we purchase can fulfill us, that the kind of car I drive says something about my personality, or maybe even creates one for me, right? Like a whole season of consumer gifts to celebrate the birth of a self-sacrificing God, right? We have these things. It's easy to see it there. It's easy to critique it there. But our cultural propensity to focus on our own needs, personal, familial, community, interest groups, party, whatever it is, it's not only there in our consumerism, in the close association of American freedom with a freedom to consume. And what became clear during the Carter administration was America's belief, in their own God-given right to cheap gas. It's not only there. It's also there, and this is more difficult, more contentious, in our penchant for identity politics, in the way that we approach and handle identity politics. Now, what's come to be known as identity politics is the tendency to work in the political arena to increase the justice, and mostly really to decrease the abject injustice that characterizes one or another identity group. Racial, ethnic minorities or groups, a whole range of gender identities and expressions, religious adherence, though that may be less so in the 21st century. These movements, and others that I've not listed, many I'm not familiar with, have been instrumental in bending the arc of the universe through national, state, and local laws just a little bit closer to justice. With what we now call, without what we now call identity politics, we wouldn't have had civil rights, women's suffrage, gender rights, disability rights, all kinds of movements, many of which we now, as a culture, take for granted, right? They've become history, and in that way, a real part of our living myth. Because the human truth does seem to be that we mobilize ourselves to defend and increase the rights of our own. Ourselves, our families, our community, our people, whatever we understand that to be. One thing that I hope this class has shown, and that I hope this particular angle on the nation's history has shown, is that America has a great many oppressed groups. Those groups change through time, but injustice has permeated our nation's history. And injustice, social injustice, the suffering or oppression of one or another group just for being that one or another group, it's totalizing. It diminishes the whole. It diminishes us all. It brings untold and unfathomable suffering upon those of the oppressed group, but it diminishes us all generationally. Especially, and maybe the more so, because that injustice contradicts or betrays the ideals towards which every social justice movement works. Those ideals which American culture across the ideological board claims to believe in, to represent, to uphold, and defend. Right? So I know that this class has been depressing for many of you, and I'm recording this final lecture to make sure I'm clear on one point especially. I do have hope for the future. And in large part because, with all of its unforgivable, inhumane, and dehumanizing flaws, I have faith in the past. Bacevich writes that only by remembering and confronting what we have largely chosen to ignore will Americans be able to choose a different course. And that seems obvious to me. Our culture will, like all cultures, change. If we're to change it for the better, to engender a systemic revolution and closer approximation to the ideals of liberty and justice, of self-evident truths and inalienable rights, then a couple things are for sure. Number one, we have to relinquish our willful ignorance regarding the thoroughgoing effects of American militarization on the battlefronts and the home fronts. Relinquish that willful ignorance. And regarding the interconnection and inextricability of those fronts, right? War and civil unrest, those are connected. And we need to undergo the frightening and really dangerous revolution of heart and mind as a culture, away from the self-serving defensive avarice that has rendered us complacent about anything that doesn't directly affect us, and toward a self-sacrificial acceptance of the common good with all that entails. Now, it's a lot. The uncomplicated, unconsidered myths we've imbibed from our youth, they're not helping us to commit that frightening and dangerous revolution, right? The way a culture, including our own, approaches its myths unthinkingly allows those myths to function, Bacevich again here, as a salve for what remains of the American conscience. Myths, he tells us, offer reassurances that America remains, as Ronald Reagan put it, still a land of heroes with all the courage and love of freedom that ever was before. Now, I hope that this semester has shown you that American history does have heroes who lived their lives with all the courage and love of freedom that ever was. It's also got its villains, and none of it's altogether simple. Because if it is, then there's no sense in trying to change it. No reason to work towards that aspirational goal of a more perfect union. Either bask in its glory or burn it all down, right? No civic engagement required. But I don't buy that. And history doesn't reflect the simple view, clearly good or altogether evil. Remember Doty. Myth is what recurs, what can't be forgotten. It puts individual experience in a universal perspective. It relates the micro to the macro, the individual to the larger group. That's what it wants to do, often without explicitly saying it. It's Quinn's mother culture, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, again, often without explicit telling, without knowing there's a story there, right? Whatever the myth is, we're part of it. It's conflicted, so we are too. There's no monomyth, not even on the individual level. Some might wish there were, but there's not. There is a coherent and complex macro myth in which we all partake and in which we all participate. The best thing you can do to support a monomyth is to be or stay complacent. Your complacency is your co-optation by the state, by the powerful, in the interest of power, by consumer inertia and imperialistic self-righteousness. In the American myth, young that it is, experimental that it is, a great deal turns on the balance between individual rights and the common good. Think back to Franklin, Jefferson, right? On the relationship between liberty and security. On our individual, personal, small-scale relationship to the whole, to this beautiful and inspiring and horrific and unjust and genocidal and exceptional thing that is America. This nation dedicated to preserving the unalienable rights of all, holding to the self-evident mythic truth that all are created equal. So what's our relationship to this place and to this idea? Is it duty? Do we have a duty? To whom and in what context might we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor? Is it possible at this point in history for us to listen to the voice of duty, of honor, and with Tecumseh of nature and of our own endangered country? The DoD, the Department of Defense, has for well over a decade listed climate change as the number one threat to national security, incidentally. But politically, socially speaking, as inheritors of the colonial project, can we form one body, one heart, and defend to our last warrior, our country, our homes, our liberty, and the graves of our fathers? Can Tecumseh speak to me, along with the Declaration? All semester war. All semester the battlefront, the home front, justice, injustice, honor, cowardice, liberty, security, bad choices, so easy to see in hindsight, selfishness and greed, so easy to see in other, corruption, so easy to see in the powerful. And at this point, in the present, in our real lives, can we take from the honored and the dishonored dead an increased devotion to that cause of truth, of liberty, of equality under the law, of democracy, that a government of, by, and for the people shall not perish from the earth? Can we find here something other than that same old stupid plan of dog eat dog, of mighty crush the weak? Is Hughes right that it's we, the people, who must redeem the land, the mines, the plants, the rivers? And our culture, can this diverse political body share a culture? Aspire towards a more perfect union? Can we imagine a frontier free from bloodshed, from even a Cold War, an FDR frontier, a frontier of sacrifice and shared obligation to rid the world of fear and of want? Can we imagine an ideological frontier, unifying around a commitment to social justice, to shared ideals, where the racket's been smashed and everyone has bread and maybe even roses? Can we reclaim and recuperate those shared ideals, let the vigor flow like tides into our blood, giving us strength erect against their hate, with McKay? Because those ideals are full of hate, of course. We the people isn't us here, any of us. The American dream, whatever it is, was mortgaged a long time ago. It's only the debt that's ours, and we don't even know how to share that. So what do we owe, Do we or can we join Ike in prayer that all who yearn for freedom may experience its spiritual blessings, and that those who have freedom will understand also its heavy responsibilities? Do we accept those responsibilities? What kind of nation are we? Where do we go from here? Think about McCain, Washington, Obama, Kennedy, right? If this is a country of freedom, let it be a country of freedom, Malcolm X told us. And if it's not a country of freedom, change it. Complacency kills. Our comfort cannot be worth more than our ideals. Right along with Ginsburg, our queer shoulders need to be at the wheel. JFK said, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable." Martin Luther King said, "In the end, the riot is the language of the unheard." And Paine, remember back to Paine, "If there be troubles, let them be in our time, that our children might know peace." And civics, this is in some ways, it's been a civics class. Civics comes down to, what are you willing to pay? What are you willing to sacrifice? In 2019, the U.S. Attorney General said that police protection is conditional upon the respect of those who want to be protected. Okay. The argument's there, and it's ready if you want it. If it was even kind of true in 1964, the argument's, it's there now. The ballot doesn't work, it's time for the bullet. And we can redeem ourselves through violence, peace through war, security through strength. It's wrapped up for us, and it's Orwellian. Maybe part of human nature, maybe exceptionally American. We're a nation born of war. Heroic, revolutionary war, waged by an embedded insurgent force against a global superpower, right? The underdog story, and war would set us free. If there be troubles, let them be in our time, that our children may know peace. That war was revolutionary and redemptive, and it built something new under the sun, a city on a hill, the first republic in human history to assert the universal and equal protection of the law. And think about that. Of course, that promise was made in the context of slavery and genocide, and it's never been fulfilled. We're a nation born of war, the heroic Revolutionary War and the genocidal war that was its natal twin, the war that made possible the fulfillment of our manifest destiny, its own genocidal campaign. So the ballot or the bullet, right? Maybe it's time. Maybe the tree of liberty needs to be watered. And maybe blood sacrifice renders freedom and hope and equality. But war is a means to a political end. War isn't any kind of inherently redemptive. It isn't probably redemptive at all. And history isn't nature. however much myth would have it be. History isn't nature, and it also isn't clear, however much mother culture would have it be. War is a means to a political end. And if we are a nation of ideals, not blood and soil, as McCain told us, right? And if we do uphold and advance those ideals, then there has to always be hope that we can achieve our political ends peacefully. And we should try. The effort has to be real, the hope has to be there, because the death count has been and it will be too much to bear. Obama reminds us that our rights have never been self-executing. Our democracy is threatened whenever we take it for granted. I have a quote here from Randolph Bourne, who was writing toward the end of World War I and about looking back at the beginning before the U.S. entered World War I but had declared neutrality. Remember, Wilson's first move was to declare official neutrality. It stayed that way for a while. This is what he said. During the years of U.S. neutrality, our intellectual class might have spent the time in endeavoring to clear the public mind of the cant of war, to get rid of the old mystical notions that clog our thinking. We might have used the time for setting our house in spiritual order, for turning not to the problem of jockeying the nation into war, but to the problem of using our vast neutral power to attain democratic ends. Without the use of the malevolent technique of war, they might have failed. The point is that they scarcely tried. Knowing the story of America means knowing a story that can unify a diverse group of people around a common cause. It means knowing the story of our better angels and of the demons, but, the demons are distractions. That's their role. God knows you've got bigger problems coming your way. So, in the interest of ending on a high note, and recognizing that we do have a relationship to the myths that are living, and that we're living in and through them, and that we will shape them for the future, right? MLK said that we don't make history, history makes us, right? But we do make the future. And so I'll close with a line from Aaron Toole, whom you met in lecture earlier, USMC and UC Berkeley ceramicist, who says that I don't think anything that I do will change the world, but nothing in the world releases me from my obligation to try. So I wish you well. Let's go try. Let's make that good effort. Let's believe in the possibility of our own self-empowered choice to own this history and bend it